In 1949, a major event occurred in Asia. The Communist Party of China led the Chinese people to achieve a great victory in the Democratic Revolution. The People's Republic of China was founded. The victory of the Chinese Revolution, following the success of the October Revolution, was a major event in the history of the international communist movement, profoundly changing the global political landscape. After the founding of New China, in foreign policy it implemented the lean-to-one-side strategy, fully aligning with the socialist camp led by the Soviet Union. On February 14, 1950, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance was signed. China and the Soviet Union, in politics, economy, military, and culture, carried out comprehensive cooperation, establishing an alliance between the two nations. Sino-Soviet relations entered a honeymoon period. With China's entry, the socialist camp across Eurasia became one solid bloc. The confrontation between the two camps expanded from the Atlantic to the Western Pacific, giving the Cold War a truly global scope. In 1950, the confrontation between the capitalist and socialist camps spread to the Korean Peninsula. The northern part of the peninsula bordered China and the Soviet Union. The east faced Japan across the sea. Because of its unique geographical position, it could serve as the last defensive shield of the continent to the east, and also as the forward base for maritime powers to attack. It had long been a place that military powers vied to control. It was an important strategic buffer zone in the rivalry of great powers. Since modern times, over the issue of control of the Korean Peninsula, 3 major wars had broken out. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894, the Qing dynasty was defeated. The tributary relationship between China and Korea ended. Korea fell under Japan's control. In 1904, during the Russo-Japanese War, Japan defeated Russia, tightening its grip over the Korean Peninsula. In 1910, through the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty, Japan officially annexed Korea, turning the peninsula into its colony. After the end of World War II in 1945, Japan withdrew from the Korean Peninsula, and the United States and the Soviet Union divided their spheres of influence along the 38th parallel. The North was under Soviet trusteeship, forming the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the South under U.S. trusteeship, forming the Republic of Korea. Similar to Germany, the Korean Peninsula was divided into 2 completely opposing states with different ideologies and social systems. After the withdrawal of U.S. and Soviet troops, both North and South Korea sought unification of the peninsula. Thus, on June 25, 1950, the Korean War broke out, shocking the world. At the beginning of the war, the Korean People's Army won successive victories, capturing the South Korean capital, Seoul, in just 3 days, and soon controlled more than 90% of the peninsula's territory. The United States believed that communist forces were expanding rapidly in Asia, posing a serious threat to U.S. and Western security. On September 15, 1950, United Nations forces led by the U.S. landed at Incheon, reversing the situation. In October, the U.S.-Rukh coalition crossed the 38th parallel, pushing the front line up to the Sino-Korean border, seriously threatening China's national security. To defend the homeland, China formed the People's Volunteer Army to fight in Korea, and after 5 campaigns against U.S. forces, pushed the front line back near the 38th parallel, forcing the U.S. to accept negotiations. On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom, Korean War was the first large-scale local hot war after the outbreak of the Cold War. Originally a civil war within Korea, as it escalated, major powers like China, the US, and the Soviet Union were drawn in, making it the symbol of the Cold War's eruption in Asia. Before the Korean War, whether in World War I or II, the United States had achieved total victory. But on the small Korean peninsula, the US fought for 3 years with no results, which deeply shocked America and forced it to reassess China's strength. When the US breathed a sigh of relief after the Korean armistice, it did not expect that another, deeper abyss in Asia was waiting for it. From 1885 to 1940, Vietnam was a French colony. In 1940, after France surrendered to Germany, Japan invaded and occupied Vietnam. After World War II, Ho Chi Minh led the Vietnamese people, and on September 2, 1945, declared the founding of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Soon after, French colonialists returned in an attempt to reconquer Vietnam, and on April 27, 1949, they installed the exiled Emperor Bao Dai, establishing the Bao Dai regime in South Vietnam. After 9 years of resistance against France, on May 7, 1954, the French army at Dien Bien Phu was surrounded by the Vietnam People's Army. The French surrendered their weapons. On July 21st, the Geneva Armistice Agreement was signed, stipulating that the 17th parallel would divide Vietnam into North and South. After France withdrew its troops, the U.S. replaced France and continued to support South Vietnam, backing Ngo Dinh Diem to form an anti-communist government. Between 1955 and 1961, the U.S. provided South Vietnam each year with about $200 million in economic aid and large amounts of military assistance, but with little effect. In fact, opposition to Diem's rule grew stronger in South Vietnam. In 1961, the Kennedy administration took power and decided that in Vietnam, the U.S. must demonstrate its resolve to contain communism. It began increasing U.S. military advisors in Vietnam and sent the first group of American special forces there, marking the beginning of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. But these actions could not hide the fact that the South Vietnamese government lacked popular support. Just as the Kennedy administration was troubled by the growing insurgency in Vietnam, a fire broke out in America's backyard. On October 14, 1962, 2 U.S. U-2 reconnaissance planes flying over Cuba took a large number of photos, and experts discovered that Cuba was building a medium and long-range missile base, confirming that nuclear warheads were being installed. The U.S. was shocked by the discovery, and the Cold War entered its peak. The most intense confrontation, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, Fidel Castro led the Cuban people to victory in the revolution, establishing the Revolutionary Government of Cuba. In 1961, relations between the U.S. and Cuba broke down, and Cuba turned toward the Soviet Union, requesting economic and military aid. This made Soviet leader Khrushchev determined. Due to the needs of the U.S.-Soviet rivalry, the U.S. had already deployed missiles in Italy and Turkey that could reach the Soviet Union. The Soviets were also eager to find a foothold in the Americas to achieve strategic balance with the U.S. geographically. Cuba was the best forward base for the Soviet Union to threaten the U.S. Thus, the Soviet Union increased its economic and military assistance to Cuba, deciding to deploy in Cuba offensive missiles capable of threatening U.S. territory. After that, the Soviet Union secretly sent large numbers of experts and technical units, continuously transporting medium-range missiles and cruise missiles, along with nuclear-armed bombers and fighters. By October 14th, US U-2 aircraft had discovered the missile sites in Cuba. On October 17th, the U.S. dispatched 6 more U-2s to gather intelligence over Cuba's missile bases. The intelligence agency assessed that the maximum range of the missiles was 3,700 kilometers. They could strike all major U.S. industrial cities, including Washington, D.C., with only 5 minutes warning time. On October 18th, the U.S. military held discussions. General LeMay, the former commander of the Tokyo bombing, called for an immediate strike. On October 20th, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade. On October 22nd, Kennedy delivered a televised address, declaring the nation in a state of highest emergency, announcing that the Soviet Union had deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, declaring an armed blockade of the island, and demanding that the Soviet Union withdraw all offensive missiles from Cuba. At the same time, U.S. forces around the world went on full alert. Nuclear-armed bombers flew one after another over Cuban waters. At this moment, the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its most tense point, the brink of World War III, with the shadow of nuclear war covering the entire world. America's tough response shocked the Soviet leadership. Khrushchev had underestimated the U.S. intelligence network and the hardline stance of the Kennedy administration, but he did not yield either. On October 23rd, Khrushchev ordered the entire Soviet military to full combat readiness and accelerated the construction of missile bases. On October 24th, a U.S. fleet of 90 warships surrounded and blockaded Cuban waters. American missile forces stood ready on the launch pads, awaiting orders. It was the largest military mobilization in the U.S. since World War II. On October 25th, a number of Soviet ships entered Cuban waters. Kennedy was extremely nervous, uncertain whether Soviet ships would comply with U.S. inspections, and whether frontline troops would truly wait for his order before opening fire. Khrushchev was equally uneasy, worried that Soviet submarines might resist if challenged by U.S. forces. After a round of probing, Khrushchev decided that ships carrying civilian goods would continue forward and forbid U.S. boarding, while ships carrying offensive weapons must not cross the blockade line, and instead wait in safe waters. Kennedy then ordered that no Soviet ships outside the blockade zone be intercepted, boarded, or harassed. On October 26th, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow received a rambling letter from Khrushchev. In it, he stated that if the U.S. guaranteed not to invade Cuba, the Soviet Union could make full concessions. The Soviets were the first to show goodwill. Just as the situation eased, on October 27th, a minor clash between U.S. and Soviet forces occurred, causing tension to rise again. Khrushchev grew anxious, for at that time the Soviet Union was at a nuclear disadvantage and did not wish to engage in all-out war with the U.S. Kennedy also believed it was better to sacrifice the U.S. missile base in Turkey than to trigger a nuclear war. No one wanted to bring the world to destruction. On October 28th, after learning of Kennedy's position, Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of missiles from Cuba. After receiving the Soviet confirmation, Kennedy pledged to remove U.S. missiles deployed in Turkey. The crisis was finally resolved. Both sides withdrew nuclear weapons placed behind enemy lines. The U.S. and the Soviet Union each achieved acceptable results, and a nuclear war was averted, a relatively satisfactory ending. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. refocused its resources on the Vietnam War. Although the U.S. had already provided massive military aid and military advisors, training and arming South Vietnamese forces, since 1964, South Vietnam suffered defeat after defeat against the North. And the situation in Vietnam turned increasingly unfavorable for the U.S. On March 2, 1965, President Johnson approved Operation Rolling Thunder, a large-scale bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and U.S. forces began direct involvement. Behind the Vietnam People's Army stood China and the Soviet Union, providing economic and military aid. Learning from the Korean War, to avoid provoking Chinese intervention, the U.S. always refrained from crossing the 17th parallel. Meanwhile, Southern guerrillas relied on the North as a base, persisting in guerrilla attacks. Over time, the Vietnam War became a bottomless pit that trapped the United States. U.S. losses grew heavier, and within America, anti-war movements erupted repeatedly. Finally, in 1973, the U.S. began withdrawing troops from Vietnam, and in 1976, North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh unified the country. The Vietnam War dealt a heavy blow to the United States. U.S. military casualties totaled 360,000, costing about $250 billion. A huge price paid for nothing. The U.S. domestic economy declined sharply. Since the start of the Cold War, whether it was the Berlin Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the U.S. had always held the initiative. But as America sank into the quagmire of Vietnam, its strength declined sharply, and the Soviet Union accelerated the development of strategic nuclear weapons, its military power catching up with and surpassing the U.S., fundamentally transforming the Cold War landscape.